To remember is to do something as much as to shoe a horse or to cherish a keepsake. To propose, to observe, to be kindly affectioned are terms of value of practice of operation, just as digression, respiration, locomotion express functions, not observable objects. But there is an object that may be described: lungs, stomach, leg muscles, etc. Through the structure we present to ourselves the function. It appears laid out before us, spread forth in detail, objectified in a word. The anatomist who devotes himself to this detail may, if he please, and he probably does please to concentrate his devotion, ignore the function to discover what is there, to analyze, to measure, to describe, gives him outlet enough. But nevertheless, it is the function that fixed the point of departure, that prescribed the problem, and that set the limits, physical as well as intellectual, of subsequent investigation. Reference to function makes the details discovered other than a jumble of incoherent trivialities. One might as well devote himself to the minute description of a square yard of desert soil, were it not for this translation. States of consciousness are the morphology of certain functions. Thus, to divorce structure psychology from function psychology is to leave us without possibility of scientific comprehension of function, while it deprives us of all standard of reference in selecting, observing, and explaining the structure. What is true of analysis of description is equally true of classification. Knowing, willing, feeling name states of consciousness not in terms of themselves, but in terms of acts, attitudes found in experience. The following answer may fairly be anticipated. This is true of the operations cited, but only because complex processes have been selected. Such a term as knowing does not, of course, express a function involving a system of intricate references, but for that very reason we go back to the sensation, which is the genuine type of the state of consciousness as such, pure and unadulterated and unsophisticated. The point is large for a footnote, but the following considerations are instructive. First, the same psychologist will go on to inform us that sensations as we experience them are networks of reference. They are perceptual and more or less conceptual as well, from which it would appear that whatever else they are or are not, the sensations for which self-enclosed existence is claimed, are not states of consciousness. And second, we are told that these are reached by scientific abstraction in order to account for complex forms, from which it would appear that they are hypothecated as products of interpretation and for purposes of further interpretation. Only the delusion that the more complex forms are just aggregates, instead of being acts like seeing, hoping, etc., prevents recognition of the point in question, that the state of consciousness is an instrument of inquiry or methodological appliance. Explanation, even of an empirical sort, is impossible as a determination of a state and its classification when we rigidly confine ourselves to modifications of consciousness as a self-existent. Sensations are always defined, classified, and explained by reference to conditions which, according to the theory, are extraneous, sense organs and stimuli. The whole physiological side assumes a ludicrous anomalous aspect of this basis. On the other hand, if what we are trying to get at is just the course and procedure of experiencing, of course, any consideration that helps distinguish and make comprehensible that process is thoroughly pertinent. While experimentation is retained and even made much of, it is at the cost of logical coherence. To experiment with reference to a bare state of consciousness is a performance of which one cannot imagine the nature, to say nothing of doing it, while to experiment with reference to acts and the conditions of their occurrence is a natural and straightforward undertaking. Such simple processes as association are concretely inexplicable when we assume states of consciousness as existences by themselves. As recent psychology testifies, we again have to resort to conditions that have no place, nor calling on the basis of the theory, the principle of habit, of neural action, or else some connection in the object. It may avoid misunderstanding if I anticipate here a subsequent remark, that my point is not in the least that states of consciousness require some synthetic unity, or faculty of substantial mind to effect their association. Quite the contrary, for this theory also admits the states of consciousness as existences in themselves as well. My contention is that the state of consciousness, as such, is always a methodological product developed in the course and for the purposes of psychological analysis. We have only to note that there are two opposing schools in psychology to see in what an unscientific status is the subject. We have only to consider that these two schools are the result of assuming states of consciousness as existences per se to locate the source of the scientific scandal. No matter what the topic, whether memory or association or attention or effort, the same dualisms present themselves, the same necessity of choosing between two schools. One, lost in the distinctions that it has developed, denies the function because it can find objectively presented only states of consciousness. So it abrogates the function, regarding it as a mere aggregate of such states, or as a purely external and factitious relation between them. The other school, recognizing that this procedure explains away rather than explains the values of experience, attempts to even up by declaring that certain functions are themselves immediately given data of consciousness, existing side by side with these states, but definitely transcending them in worth and apprehended by some higher organ. So against the elementary contents and external associations of the analytic school in psychology, we have the complicated machinery of the intellectualist school, with its pure self-consciousness as a source of ultimate truth, its hierarchy of intuitions, its ready-made faculties. To be sure, these spiritual faculties are now largely reduced to some one comprehensive form, apperception or will or attention, or whatever the fashionable term may be, but the principle remains the same, the assumption of a function as a given existent, distinguishable in itself and acting upon other existences, as if the functions digestion and vision were regarded as separate from organic structures, somehow acting upon them from the outside so as to bring cooperation and harmony into them. The functions are in truth ordinary everyday acts and attitudes, seeing, smelling, talking, listening, remembering, hoping, loving, fearing. This division into psychological schools is as reasonable as would be one of the botanists into rootists and flowerists, of those proclaiming the root to be the rudimentary and essential structure, and those asserting that since the function of seed-bearing is the main thing, the flower is really the controlling synthetic principle. Both sensationalists and intellectualists suppose that psychology has some special sphere of reality, or of experience marked off for it, within which the data are just lying around, self-existent and ready-made, to be picked up and assorted as pebbles await the visitor on the beach. Both alike fail to recognize that the psychologist first has experience to deal with, the same experience that the zoologist, geologist, chemist, mathematician, and historian deal with, and that what characterizes his specialty is not some data or existences which he may call uniquely his own, but the problem of the course of the acts that constitute experiencing. Here psychology gets its revenge upon those who would rule it out of possession of important philosophical bearing. As a matter of fact, a larger part of the questions that are being discussed in current epistemology and what is termed metaphysic of logic and ethic arise out of and are hopelessly compromised by this original assumption of consciousness as such. In other words, are provoked by the exact reason that is given for denying to psychology any essential meaning for epistemology and metaphysic. Such is the irony of the situation. The epistemologist's problem is indeed usually put as the question of how the subject can so far transcend itself as to get valid assurance of the objective world. The very phraseology in which the problem is put reveals the thoroughness of the psychologist's revenge. Just and only because experience has been reduced to states of consciousness as independent existences, does the question of self-transcendence have any meaning. The entire epistemological industry is one, shall I say it, of a Sisyphean nature, mutatis mutandis. The same holds of the metaphysic of logic, ethic, and aesthetic. In each case, the basic problem has come to be how a mere state of consciousness can be the vehicle of a system of truth, of an objectively valid good, of beauty which is other than agreeable feeling. We may indeed excuse the psychologist for not carrying on the special inquiries that are the business of logical, ethical, and aesthetical philosophy, but can we excuse ourselves for forcing his results into such a shape as to make philosophic problems so arbitrary that they are solvable only by arbitrarily wrenching scientific facts? Undoubtedly, we are between two fires in placing upon psychology the responsibility of discovering the method of experience as a sequence of acts and passions. Do we not destroy just that limitation to concrete detail which now constitutes it a science? Will not the psychologist be the first to repudiate this attempt to mix him up in matters philosophical? We need only to keep in mind the specific facts involved in the term course or process of experience to avoid this danger. The immediate preoccupation of the psychologist is with very definite and empirical facts, questions like the limits of audition, of the origin of pitch, of the structure and conditions of the muscle scale, etc. Just so the immediate affair of the geologist is with particular rock structures, of the botanist with particular plants, and so on. But through the collection, description, location, classification of rocks, the geologist is led to the splendid story of world forming. The limited, fixed, and separate piece of work is dissolved away in the fluent and dynamic drama of the earth. So the plant leads with inevitableness to the whole process of life and its evolution. In form, the botanist still studies the genus, the species, the plant, hardly indeed that, rather the special parts, the structural elements of the plant. In reality, he studies life itself. The structures are the indications, the signature through which he renders transparent the mystery of life growing in the changing world of biology. It was doubtless necessary for the botanist to go through the Linnaean period, the period of engagement with rigid detail and fixed classifications, of tearing apart and piecing together, of throwing all emphasis upon peculiarities of number, size, and appearance, of material structure, of regarding change, growth, and function as external, more or less interesting attachments to form. Examination of this period is instructive. There is much in contemporary investigation and discussion that is almost unpleasantly reminiscent in its suggestiveness. The psychologist should profit by the intervening history of science. The conception of evolution is not so much an additional law as it is a face-about. The fixed structure, the separate form, the isolated element, is henceforth at best a mere stepping stone to knowledge of process, and, when at its best, marks the end of comprehension and betokens failure to grasp the problem. With the change in standpoint from self-included existence to including process, from structural unit of composition to controlling unity of function, from changeless form to movement and growth, the whole scheme of values is transformed. Faculties are definite directions of development. Elements are products that are starting points for new processes. Bare facts are indices of change. Static conditions are modes of accomplished adjustment. Not that the concrete empirical phenomenon loses in worth, much less that unverifiable metaphysical entities are impertinently introduced, but that our aim is the discovery of a process of actions and its adaptations to circumstance. If we apply this evolutionary logic in psychology, where shall we stop? Questions of limits of stimuli in a given sense, say hearing, are in reality questions of temporary arrests, adjustments marking the favorable equilibrium of the whole organism. They connect with the question of the use of sensation in general and auditory sensations in particular for life habits, of the origin and use of localized and distinguished perception, and this in turn involves within itself the whole question of space and time recognition, the significance of the thing and quality experience, and so on. And when we are told that the question of the origin of space experience has nothing at all to do with the question of the nature and significance of the space experienced, the statement is simply evidence that the one who makes it is still at the static standpoint. He believes that things, that relations, have existence and significance, apart from the particular conditions under which they come into experience, and apart from the special service rendered in those particular conditions. Of course, I am far from saying that every psychologist must make the whole journey. Each individual may contract as he pleases for any section or subsection he prefers, and undoubtedly the well-being of the science is advanced by such division of labor. But psychology goes over the whole ground from detecting every distinct act of experiencing to seeing what need calls out the special organ fitted to cope with the situation, and discovering the machinery through which it operates to keep a-going the course of action. But I shall be told the wall that divides psychology from philosophy cannot be so easily treated as non-existent. Psychology is a matter of natural history, even though it may be admitted that it is the natural history of the course of experience. But philosophy is a matter of values, of the criticism and justification of certain validities. One deals, it is said, with genius, with conditions of temporal origin and transition, the other with analysis with external or eternal constitution. I shall have to repeat that just this rigid separation of genesis and analysis seems to me a survival from a pre-evolutionary, a prehistoric age. It indicates not so much an assured barrier between philosophy and psychology as the distance dividing philosophy from all of science.